When firefighters entered 21 Rue le Sueur in Paris's 16th arrondissement on the 11th of March 1944, nothing seemed too out of the ordinary, except for the foul-smelling smoke coming out of the chimney. The smoke had been pouring out for 5 days, and the neighbours had had enough, so they notified the police, who then in turn called firefighters. When they arrived at the house, they proceeded to enter it through the second-story window, and then they made their way down to the basement. Nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to stumble upon. Sticking out of a furnace, as if waving hello, was a charred human arm. Dismembered bodies in various stages of decomposition littered the floor, with bags of bone fragments and fleshy offcuts scattered around. The firefighters were completely horrified upon what they had found, and they asked the neighbours who the house belonged to. They said that the property belonged to Dr Marcel Petiot, but he was nowhere to be found. Could this well-respected doctor really be capable of this? And who were the bodies in the basement, and how many were there? And finally, where was the doctor? Marcel André Henri Félix Petiot was born on the 17th of January, 1897, in Auxerre, North France, to his parents Félix Petiot and Marthe Bourdon, 2 postal workers. Petiot exhibited clear signs of a very high intelligence from an early age, and at just 5 years old, he was able to read at the level of a 10-year-old. He was described in his younger years as a loner, with a very short attention span, and it was around this time that his behavioural problems became evident. Petiot's parents often found their young son impaling insects on knitting needles and sticking pins into the eyes of small birds. He was also known to torture animals to death, seemingly for his own entertainment. By the age of 11, Petiot had begun passing pornographic materials around class at school, and he once sexually propositioned a fellow classmate of his. He found it highly amusing to pass shocking and disturbing images around the classroom, and he found joy in seeing the shock and upset of others. One day, 11-year-old Petiot fired a shot from his father's revolver into the ceiling of the classroom. He said he did this because he wanted to brighten up a dull lesson. Another playground pastime of Petiot's was to rope classmates into taking part in his knife-throwing demonstrations. Petiot would stand his peers against a door and then launch knives into the door frame around them. Amazingly, Petiot's throws were extraordinarily accurate, and he never actually injured anyone with his knife tricks. Throughout his troublesome childhood, his parents were worried that Petiot's antics were not normal or just innocent schoolboy pranks, so they took him to the doctors. They explained to the doctor how Petiot was prone to convulsions and sleepwalking. He was also still wetting the bed, and they expressed their concerns about him, saying they were extremely worried about his behaviour. In 1912, Petiot's mother sadly died, leaving his father to take a job 15 miles from Auxerre, where the family lived. Petiot and his brother Maurice were sent to live with an aunt until Petiot was expelled from school. He then went back to live with his father, but then was also expelled from the local school near his father's work due to his unruly behaviour. This pattern of bad behaviour and expulsions would continuously occur, and Petiot continued to grow and develop into an even more troublesome and aggressive teenager. At 17 years old, Petiot robbed a postbox, stealing mail presumed to be for blackmail purposes. Following this incident, Petiot was charged with mail theft and damage to public property, and when he went to court, it was suggested he undergo psychological evaluation. On the 26th of March 1914, the court-appointed psychiatrist found Petiot to be an abnormal youth, suffering from personal and hereditary problems, which limited to a large degree his responsibility for his acts. The charges against young Petiot were however subsequently dropped, as the judge deemed Petiot mentally unfit to stand trial. After being expelled from at least 2 more schools in France, mostly due to his kleptomania tendencies. Kleptomania is an addiction to petty theft, stealing not out of necessity but due to difficulties with impulse control, a pattern that had already made itself very apparent in Petiot's life. Petiot's father was increasingly troubled by his son's constant school expulsions, and he finally sent him to a special academy in Paris, where Petiot finally managed to graduate in 1915. As was the case with the majority of young men in France at the time, 18-year-old Petiot enlisted in the French army within a year of finishing school, and he was sent to the front lines of World War I in January 1916. In one of the battles, Petiot was gassed and wounded by grenade fragments, and he started to show signs of a complete mental breakdown. Petiot was sent to a variety of rest homes and mental health care facilities, where he was caught stealing military blankets, morphine, wallets, photographs and personal letters that belonged to other residents. He was jailed in Orléans and shortly transferred to the military psychiatrist unit in Fleury-les-Aubrais for observation. During this stint in hospital, Petiot was able to watch all the other people in the ward suffering, and he learnt how to mimic that behaviour and how to appear distressed. A doctor at the psychiatric hospital diagnosed Petiot with mental disequilibrium, neurasthenia, mental depression, melancholia, obsession and phobias, and it was concluded he was therefore not legally responsible for the vast amounts of thievery whilst at the facility. However, despite all of this, he was returned to the front lines in June of 1918. 3 weeks later, Petiot experienced another nervous breakdown and allegedly shot himself in the foot with his own pistol, but he was still assigned to a new regiment regardless. After complaining of debilitating headaches, he was returned to the hospital yet again. From here, he then spent a year in mental institutions and had multiple epileptic seizures that led him to bite his own tongue, and in the process scarring it. The French army then, therefore, discharged Petiot with a 40% disability pension and a recommendation for psychiatric institutionalization. His disability pension was then increased to 100% in 1920, and it was heavily suggested that Petiot live out the rest of his days in hospital. However, by this point, Petiot had experienced enough of the hospital system as a patient for his lifetime. He loathed the authority and being told what to do and when to do it. Petiot wanted to change the narrative. He wanted a taste of that power, and he knew just the career to follow to harness it. Petiot decided to become a doctor. Having lost such a huge amount of the population to World War I, France held an accelerated education program for war veterans, which Petiot took absolute advantage of. Petiot completed his medical studies in merely 8 months at the University of Paris, followed by a 2-year internship at a mental hospital. On the 15th of December 1921, Dr Marcel Petiot received his official medical diploma, declaring him a fully fledged physician. This degree to this day has been questioned by professionals, as this is an extremely short amount of time to become a medical doctor. Today, in some countries, it can take upwards of 10 years for a medical student to become a licensed doctor. First a 4-year degree and pre-med exam, followed by 4 years of general medicine education and rotations, then a year's internship, and finally a residency program that can be between 3 to 8 years depending on the speciality. Even by the standards of the early to mid-1900s, Petiot's path to becoming a licensed doctor was far too expedited to truly prepare him for competent solo practice. Regardless of this, Petiot took his degree and license to Villeneuve-sur-Yonne, a historical village with a population of 4,000. Petiot aggressively advertised his practice, comparing himself to the only other 2 doctors in town, who Petiot deemed too old for modern medicine. His flyer read in part, "Dr. Petiot is young, and only a young doctor can keep up to date on the latest methods born of progress, which marches with great strides. This is why intelligent patients have confidence in him. Dr. Petiot treats, but does not exploit his patients." His plan worked, and within a couple of years, he was a respected member of the community, with a dedicated client base who loved the young doctor. However, a change in title did not change Dr. Petiot's behavioural problems. Petiot would frequently swipe the belongings of his patients on home visits, and his brother Maurice would check Petiot's pockets before allowing him to leave the house he had visited. The petty theft was somewhat of an open secret in Villeneuve-sur-Yonne, But everyone loved Petiot so much it was easy to look the other way. Petiot had also begun to sign his patients up for a government-assisted medical scheme without their knowing, meaning he was getting paid twice for every appointment, once by the government and once by the patient. Petiot found no issue in his own behaviour, but the other local doctors and pharmacists certainly did. Doctors felt that Petiot's method of self-promotion was improper for a doctor, and that despite what his flyer said, he was indeed exploiting his patients. Pharmacists began to take issue with the quantity of dangerous narcotics that Petiot would prescribe, and in huge doses. Petiot fought back, saying that pharmacists had no right to question a medical doctor, and that the drug companies watered down their drugs anyway to make them weaker. One notable instance of this was when the local pharmacist refused to fill a prescription for a child that would have been lethal for an adult. To this, Petiot remarked that surely it would be better for the patient if the child died, as all it did was annoy its mother. Despite all this, however, Petiot's popularity amongst the residents of Villeneuve-sur-Yonne was sky-high. He was known to treat poor people for free, for opening his practice at night or over the weekends, as well as terminating pregnancies, which were illegal in France at the time. Petiot's charming nature and habit of seemingly going the extra mile for his patients made him quite a notable character around town. Despite being kicked out of his housing by his landlord for theft and being caught stealing frequently, Petiot resisted trouble with the law by saying he was a certified lunatic and could not be convicted. He was supposed to be re-evaluated by the military pension fund, but stated he would rather never receive another check than to go through the demoralizing process of evaluation again. But the checks just kept coming. He did eventually undergo assessment again in 1924, and they reduced his disability pension to 50%. Dr Marcel Petiot met 24-year-old Louisette Delavaux in 1924, the daughter of an elderly patient of his. Louisette immediately grabbed Petiot's attention, but her vocation was problematic for him. Louisette was a housekeeper, and it was simply not right for a doctor to hold a maid as a mistress, so the couple pretended that Louisette was working for Petiot, and she moved into his house. The very public affair did not take long to turn drastically sour, however. Louisette confided in her friends in May of 2026 that she was pregnant and seeking of a way to stop the pregnancy because Petiot had been unfaithful. The next day, Louisette disappeared without a trace, never to be seen again. Petiot told people that the pair had had a vicious argument and Louisette had stormed off, leaving all her belongings behind and not saying goodbye to a soul. Shortly after her disappearance, villagers saw Petiot placing a large trunk in the back of his car, and a few days later, townspeople over 100 miles away fished a suspicious-looking trunk out of the water. Inside the trunk contained the dismembered, disemboweled, decapitated body of a young woman in her early 20s. Despite some of the locals suspecting that Petiot had something to do with this discovery, luckily for him, as the body in the suitcase was so badly mutilated, it could not officially be linked to Petiot, and soon the case went cold, and police just assumed that Louisette had run away as Petiot had said. Petiot, now pleased with the ease with which he had just got away with murder, and the influence he seemed to have over the town, decided that he could be more than just a brilliant doctor. In 1926, Petiot announced his candidacy for mayor of Villeneuve-sur-Yonne. He started his political debate with, "I must confess that I'm guilty of a very serious crime. I stand accused of loving the people too much." During this speech, he hired an accomplice to cut the power to the auditorium just as his opponent was about to speak. This actually ended up cutting the power to the entire town and started several fires, but it did the job in the end, and in July of 1926, Petiot was elected mayor in a landslide victory. Unsurprisingly, Petiot began to take city funds from the town's clerk's desk for his own use, and his position of power did nothing to curb his kleptomania. Petiot was seen stealing the bass drum of a band he disliked, as well as a stone cross and money from the treasury. He was also seen jumping off a moving train when it didn't stop at his preferred station, but this was merely endearing to the villagers. They were willing to turn a blind eye to the petty theft and corruption in Petiot's office, because Petiot was helping them get a new sewer system and a new schoolhouse. In 1927, Petiot met Georgette Valentine Lablé, the 23-year-old daughter of a very well-respected and influential landowner in the Yonne region. The two got married and had one child together, Gérard, who was born on the 19th of April, 1928. 8 months later, Petiot was accused of stealing oil cans from the railroad depot. He had actually purchased the cans, but he was guilty of fraudulent behavior, having said he never received the shipment and claiming a refund. He was fined 200 francs and was sentenced to 3 months in jail, and in turn was temporarily suspended as mayor for 4 months, before the conviction was reversed on appeal. During this turbulent time for the mayor, the village itself was struck by a dramatic tragedy. On the evening of the 11th of March 1930, a local dairy cooperative owner named Armand Dubert returned to his home to find the whole building engulfed in flames. Knowing his wife Henriette had been at home, he ran into the house to find her dead body on the kitchen floor, beaten and bloody, as the fire raged around her. As the fire department were tackling the flames, Dr Petiot and his wife drove past the scene. To everyone's disgust, the village doctor didn't stop to aid in the medical crisis or even to offer his sympathies to Armand. Instead, Petiot carried on driving and enjoyed an evening out at the cinema with his wife. Based on the timing of the attack, being when Armand was out and the night before he was due to distribute his monthly payments to dairy farms, investigators deduced that the culprit must have known the family personally. The 20,000 francs missing from the home further encouraged their theory that it was a burglary gone wrong. Armand's wife must have got in the way of the robbery, so the thief bashed her head in with a blunt instrument. As soon as these details were released to the public, the locals desperately tried to find someone to implicate based on what they knew, but the only person who matched the profile was the town's cherished mayor, Dr Petiot. The rumour mill started, and Petiot himself even wrote an anonymous piece of paper that detailed the murder so explicitly and specifically that investigators were as impressed as they were concerned. When Petiot was the only suspect who refused to give his fingerprints over, one secret witness grew troubled. Having heard talk of an affair between Petiot and Armand's wife Henriette, one local bistro owner felt obliged to come forward about the night of the fire. He had seen Petiot near the house that night, and it just seemed like too many coincidences to ignore. To build up the courage to go to the police, the witness went for a drink in town, where he encountered none other than Dr Petiot. During their chat, the bistro owner claimed of a pain he had, to which Petiot exclaimed that he would gladly take care of it. He led this witness back to his home, boasting of a new treatment that would cure him up immediately. 3 hours later, the man was dead due to a supposed aneurysm, as put on the death certificate by Petiot. Petiot briefly reclaimed his position as mayor, but after several more accusations regarding theft and financial irregularities, Petiot announced his resignation as mayor in August of 1931. Petiot was so popular with his peers, however, that the entire village council resigned in sympathy, and 5 weeks after that, he was the youngest of 34 general councillors elected in the Yonne district. However, it was a stormy tenure, and after being accused of stealing electricity from his village in 1932, the judge dubbed Petiot's defence a pure fantasy and sentenced him to 15 days in jail. Outraged that he could be treated this way, and with allegations of fraud, theft, corruption, and murder hanging over him, Petiot thought it was finally time to leave the region, and he moved his family to Paris for a fresh start in January of 1933. When he arrived in Paris, in typical Dr Petiot fashion, he promoted himself with a huge array of fake credentials to attract new clients. He handed out flyers at pharmacies, nightclubs, bars and brothels, hoping to gather the same level of trust from his clients that he had experienced from the working class in Villeneuve-sur-Yonne. On these flyers, Petiot said he could cure almost any ailment, including diabetes, cancer and gonorrhea. Outside his office at 66 Rue de Caumartin in Paris's 9th arrondissement, Petiot had so many credentials on his bronze plaque that neighbouring physicians contacted the medical association to complain. Petiot built an incredibly loyal client base, just as before. In fact, in 1944, over 2,000 patients of Dr. Petiot were interviewed, and not a single one had a bad thing to say about him. Despite his popularity, rumors were spreading that he would help terminate pregnancies, as well as overprescribing narcotics to patients in order to enable and encourage the existing drug addiction. In 1934, a 30-year-old woman named Raymond Hans came to have a dental abscess drained. Petiot drove Hans home while she was still unconscious from the anesthetic, and she then died at her home several hours later. Appalled by this blatant mistreatment, Anna Coquille, Hans's mother, demanded an autopsy of the body, which later revealed huge amounts of morphine in Hans's blood. Although the coroner postponed the burial until a full investigation had taken place, the authorities believed in popular Dr. Petiot, and the case was closed, with no charges filed. In 1942, Anna Coquille attempted to reopen the case, but this was denied. In 1936, Petiot was appointed médecin d'état civil for the 9th arrondissement of Paris, and while it was a fairly low level of authority, it did allow Petiot to officially sign death certificates, and he very much used this position for his own gain. In April of 1936, Petiot was caught red-handed trying to steal a book, and rather than hand it back to the employee, Petiot assaulted the worker, threatened him with murder, assaulted a police officer, and fled on foot. He surrendered 2 days later, providing his military discharge records as proof that he was simply not responsible for such behavior. The charges were instantly dropped on grounds of insanity, and Petiot's wife, Georgette, arranged for him to visit a private sanatorium for some rest and recovery in August. Petiot had hardly taken 5 steps into the front doors of the hospital when he fell to his knees, pleading through tears for release, because, as he said, his madness had passed. He told the psychiatric staff that it was just a momentary aberration, because he was too focused on a new suction machine invention of his that was surely going to relieve constipation. One of the doctors of the hospital wrote that Petiot was chronically unbalanced, further detailing that he was a morally unscrupulous, emotionally unstable liar. However, despite these not-so-glowing personality reviews, the doctor further recommended that Petiot's release was granted. A month later, in September of 1936, the court delayed Petiot's freedom by recommending assessments by 3 more psychiatrists chosen by the court, and while they claimed strong doubts as to Petiot's good faith at any point during this affair, there were no legal grounds for holding him, and he was released in February of 1937. Aside from consistent tax fraud, Petiot did seem to clean up his act a bit upon release. These tax frauds were that he reported less than 10% of his actual earnings between 1937 and 1940, resulting in fraud charges, but otherwise he kept his affairs in order until the entire world changed with Germany's invasion of Poland, launching World War II in September of 1939. Not long after the eruption of World War II, France was defeated by Germany. In June of 1940, Paris was declared an open city and shortly seized by German troops. A collaborationist government was established in the city of Vichy in France's south, while the north was under German occupation. On the 22nd of June, approximately 42,000 French soldiers surrendered to the Nazis. Initially, 10 people fled from the north of France in a mass exodus to the south, where the French state had been established, from Vichy, but as the occupation dragged on, more and more French patriots rose up to form the resistance. Anyone found to have links to the resistance was executed, so the organizations had to stay very much underground, with escape networks forming as a way of evacuating people in France who were wanted by the Germans or the Vichy government. Dr Marcel Petiot found business in supplying false medical disability certificates to members of the French public who were being drafted for forced labor in Germany, as well as treating sick and wounded workers upon their return, all the while gathering intel on the Nazis from those who had seen it firsthand. At the same time, Petiot boasted of his inventions that were secret weapons able to eliminate Nazis without leaving any forensic evidence behind, and said he had laid secret booby traps all over Paris. Nobody, however, ever corroborated any of these tales. In 1940, Petiot then decided to make up and create a fake operation, which he nicknamed Flytox. He said that this was an escape network, which he ran under the codename Dr Eugène. Petiot had begun spinning the tale when he visited a barber named Rue le Sueur, stating that for a small sum of 25,000 francs, Petiot could get passage to Argentina via Portugal for anyone trying to avoid capture. Petiot told Fourier that his network was called Flytox and that he was to be known as Dr Eugène. Flytox was actually the name of a popular insecticide, and Eugène was the renowned male hair care brand, and both of these items were sat clearly visible in the barbershop where Petiot had met Raoul Fourier. Petiot had clearly just stolen these names whilst he was making up his evil plan on the spot whilst at the barbershop. Raoul Fourier agreed to pass on names of potential clients to Petiot in exchange for a small cut of the money. Petiot said that the escapees should gather all their valuables, cash and jewellery so that they could have some startup money when they got to Argentina. He said that for their safety and anonymity, the customers should take any name tags off their clothing, not tell anyone where they were going, and to travel very light. In other words, Petiot was asking his victims to perfectly package themselves for him. In May of 1941, Petiot bought the now infamous house at 21 Rue le Sueur and told construction workers that it was to be a clinic and mental institution. But in fact, it was actually to become his death chamber. He constructed high walls around the property, saying that it was for the anonymity of his patients, but in fact, it was just to hide what he was really doing to these desperate evacuees. Upon entering the townhouse, Petiot would tell his victims that the Argentinian border security officials required all entrants to be inoculated against diseases and that he could provide the vaccinations in his office at the back of the house. After he closed the front door behind his victims, they would never be seen alive again. Petiot was in fact actually poisoning these people with cyanide, a powerful chemical that works by stopping the body's cells from using oxygen, starving vital organs, and ultimately leading to a total bodily shutdown. Everything about Petiot's murders was intensely planned out and clinical, leaving relatively little mess to clean up. It's believed that Petiot killed because it was a means to an end, it was efficient and led him to monetary gain. Nobody was ever going to be reported missing once they'd visited Petiot because they were avoiding the law anyway. Petiot's early customers included two men from Paris, Joseph Réaucreux and Adrien Estebetegui, who were both on the run from the Gestapo agents as well as French police, having impersonated Gestapo agents while committing an armed robbery. The Gestapo was the Nazi secret police. Joseph Réaucreux and his mistress Claudia Chameau, as well as François Albertini and Annette Basset, disappeared into 21 Rue le Sueur in September of 1942. Other known and confirmed victims include the Neller family, 3 German Jews who were fished out of the Seine, back when that was Petiot's preferred disposal method, as well as the Wolf family of 3 who vanished alongside their 6 friends after knocking on the door of 21 Rue le Sueur. Another man, known as Joseph Pierrechy, disappeared with his girlfriend, Paulette Crépy, and they were also dragged from the Seine. In fact, in 1942 and 1943, a plethora of dismembered victims were pulled from the river, including 9 heads, 4 thighs, and a myriad of other mutilated body parts. Both French and German police were baffled, as well as coroners who were unable to identify the dead due to a startling amount of decomposition. This was in part due to being submerged in water, also due to Petiot's method of breaking down the bodies. Quicklime or calcium oxide has historically been used to prevent the spread of bacterial disease on dead bodies, and also aids in hiding odours. When quicklime hits a dead body, it absorbs moisture from both the corpse and its surrounding environment. Quicklime and water combine to make calcium hydroxide, or slate lime, and in the process heat is released. This heat then kills the bacteria and odour of decay, but essentially mummifies the body by drying it out. Petiot would then have a dehydrated corpse to deal with, which would be far more brittle and easier for him to break down to dispose of in the Seine. One thing that medical examiners and coroners noted, however, was that there were very specific mutilations on each body. Every head had a shaved scalp and had eyebrows removed, and the hands had no fingerprints, as they had been burnt off with acid or filed away. While these clues showed a good knowledge of how to disguise a body, the most concerning part were tiny incision marks left in the thighs, as if the scalpel had been stuck straight into the thigh like a pin in a pincushion, which was typical practice for medical doctors at the time. Rather than place a scalpel on a surface, coroners or medics inspecting corpses would use the flesh of the thighs to hold it, rather than having an exposed blade somewhere. A doctor inspecting the body parts brought out of the Seine would definitely recognize these marks, as it was a scalpel preservation technique that was taught in physician residency programs. Petiot's skills with a scalpel or larger blade, as well as his medical know-how, certainly aided him in covering his tracks, especially when the body parts were dumped in mismatched batches. However, it was also this precision and talent that led authorities to knowing the murderer was a doctor by profession. Despite all these findings by inspectors and various medical professionals, it was actually the Gestapo who uncovered Dr. Eugène's Flytox network. In April of 1943, Gestapo officers reported a great deal of talk in public about an organization which arranged clandestine crossings of the Spanish border by means of falsifying Argentinian passports. Little did they know, however, that the victims never even left Paris. A French Jew named Yvan Dreyfus was blackmailed by Gestapo officers into infiltrating the Flytox network, but he vanished after making contact with Petiot. Another informer, Charles Beretta, fed names to Gestapo officers, leading to the arrest of Raoul Fourier, the barber, as well as two other men, Edmond Pintard and René Gustave Nézondé. The three men were tortured by Nazis and almost immediately gave up all the details they had on the mysterious Dr. Eugène, who was subsequently arrested and joined them in prison. Miraculously for Petiot, despite Nazi officers searching his home and interrogating his wife, they remained unaware of the House of Horrors at 21 Rue le Sueur. For 8 months, Petiot was brutally and horrifically tortured by the Gestapo officers and military leaders for information on the French resistance. Rather than come clean to the Nazis and explaining that he had just murdered everyone, he maintained his cover story of being a helpful doctor, playing his part in the resistance. Some torture methods used included filing his teeth, endless beatings, and crushing his head between iron plates, but that didn't stop Petiot from taunting and ridiculing the Germans at every opportunity. Other inmates who were genuine people of the resistance have said that Petiot was the bravest person they'd ever encountered, but they were unaware that it is very difficult to torture a psychopath. Psychopaths simply won't respond to punishment in the same way as other prisoners would. After 8 months in prison, Petiot and the two other informants were released in January of 1944, and rather than flee or find somewhere to hide, Petiot returned immediately to his house at 21 Rue le Sueur to dispose of the body parts littered around the basement. He asked his brother Maurice to deliver him 700 kilograms of quicklime and began to burn the bodies in the furnace. Bizarrely, rather than stay to finish the job, Petiot left the property while flesh was still burning. Psychologists have said that he maybe did this simply due to boredom in his part. He had done the parts of the job that benefited him, but when it came to disposing the bodies, he had completely lost interest. On the 6th of March 1944, thick black smoke began billowing out of the chimney of 21 Rue le Sueur. The smoke was troubling to neighbours, particularly because of the smell that they could only compare to burning rubber. After 5 days, the smoke was thicker than ever, and neighbours called the police to complain. 2 policemen arrived on their bicycles and met the neighbour who had placed the call. The neighbour told the police that the house belonged to Dr Marcel Petiot. After ringing the doorbell and knocking for several minutes to no avail, the policeman found a note attached to the door that read, "Away for 1 month. Forward mail to 18, Rue le Sueur in Auxerre." The neighbours alleged that there had been a very strange string of callers at this empty house over the last 6 months, including a man with a horse cart. They also said that a few months previously, 2 trucks had collected 47 suitcases and delivered 30 to 40 sacks. The neighbours said that Dr Petiot had a second property 2 miles away at 66 Rue Courmartin, so the police rang his home address. Petiot answered and asked if the police had entered the house, to which they replied, "No." Petiot responded, "Don't do anything, I'll be there in 15 minutes, and then hung up abruptly. 30 minutes or so later, there was still no sign of Petiot, and the smoke was only worsening, so the police called the firefighters. When they arrived at the scene, they entered the property via a second-story window and made their way through the house to the basement. The firemen soon spilled out of the front door, one of them violently throwing up as he did so, and the chief told the police, "You have some work ahead of you." When the officers entered the home, they first entered what seemed to be a doctor's examination room, but just off this room was a smaller, triangular-shaped room. This small room could only be opened from the outside, and on one of the walls were some large iron rings, which were obviously used to fasten people to. Opposite the rings, they saw a peephole embedded into the wall, which when they looked through from Petiot's examination room, it pointed directly at the iron rings. Petiot had obviously secured people to these rings, and he would then watch them dying in this small torture chamber. The officers then proceeded to carry on downstairs towards the basement, where they found a coal stove, complete with a human arm hanging out of the open door. Next to the furnace was a pile of coal that was mixed together with human bones, as well as other parts of dismembered bodies. As the shocked police left the basement, unable to even establish how many victims they'd just found, a man approached the scene on his bicycle, saying that he was the brother of the homeowner. After verifying that the police were all French, Petiot revealed his true identity in hushed tones, saying that he was a resistance leader and the bodies inside belonged only to Germans and to French traitors. Petiot appealed to their patriotic side, the side that was sick of the German occupation and Nazi regime, and the police told Petiot to flee. Officers then continued to search the true House of Horrors, uncovering grisly scene after grisly scene. In the garage, police found a heap of quicklime mixed with human remains, including a jawbone and some scalp. On the stairs leading from the courtyard to the basement, a large canvas sack was found, holding the left half of a headless corpse and the vital organs and foot removed. In the stable, police found a giant pit that had been dug, with more quicklime and decomposing corpses inside. Chief Coroner Albert Paul identified the remains of at least 10 victims, but said that this was in no way a true reflection of the death toll. As well as all of the bones and parts that were able to be identified, Dr. Paul also registered 33 pounds of charred bones, 24 pounds of unburned fragments, 11 pounds of human hair, more than 10 whole scalps, and 3 bin bags of parts too small to identify. Something that the doctor was able to identify, however, was the same minuscule scalpel marks and other signs of a medical professional's involvement as had been found on the bodies pulled from the Seine. As Commissioner Georges-Victor Massu searched the house, a telegram arrived from the police headquarters in Paris to say, "Order from German authorities, arrest Petiot, dangerous lunatic." The fact that the Germans expressed their concerns for Petiot and wanted him captured further supported Petiot's story that he was a hero of the resistance. But Commissioner Massu knew that Petiot's story was a lie and that he was in fact a monster. But it was too late. They had let him go, and when they went to his other house at 66 Rue de Courmartin, Petiot and his wife had already fled, and Petiot would not be caught for another 7 months. After D-Day, a huge surge in people signing up to be part of the resistance was seen across France. People who may not have shown such strong solidarity over the last few years, or who had perhaps sold out their neighbours to the Germans, were keen to show that they were unified with the new France. Bridges were blown up to stop German troops passing through, barricades were built, and the Vichy government was toppled. The French Forces of the Interior, the FFI, was created to fight the remaining German forces in France, pushing for freedom and liberation. In August of 1944, Marcel Petiot joined up under the pseudonym Henri Valéry and was soon made a captain in charge of the counter-espionage and prisoner interrogation in Paris. A month later, Paris was liberated and the FFI worked to hunt down and round up the collaborators left in the capital city. While French police were under the impression Petiot had fled, he was right under their nose, staying one step ahead, or so he thought. By this point, the police knew that Petiot was a serial killer, and they were very keen to catch him. They had received many calls from the public, stating that their friend had gone to visit Petiot with the hopes of fleeing France and to start a new life. But after they went to see Petiot, they never heard from their friends again. Police compiled a list of names of people they believed to be Petiot's victims, and the list just grew and grew, so they made an urgent plan to catch him. The detective in charge of Petiot's manhunt published a false story to the newspaper Resistance that exposed the doctor as a Nazi collaborator, calling him a soldier of the Reich, alleging that he had worn German uniform to round up French patriots in 1943. The story was written with the intent to anger Petiot out of hiding, and it did exactly what it was supposed to do. Exactly as they had hoped, Petiot wrote a scathing letter condemning the article as filthy lies, which confirmed to authorities that he was still in Paris and the entire police force was on high alert. At 10:15 a.m. on the 31st of October 1944, Petiot was recognized as he entered a metro station in Paris. 3 military officers approached him and asked the time, and as he raised his arm to check his watch, they pounced. One officer locked handcuffs on him, while a second kicked him to the ground to prevent him running. Petiot carried on him a pistol, 31,700 francs in cash, and 50 different identity documents in 6 different names. Petiot was held in jail for a year due to the huge amount of going on in Europe at the time, but as soon as his trial began, it dominated the headlines, with Petiot announcing to the public that he was going to have fun with this trial. Petiot's story was that he was totally innocent. He said that he had killed enemies of France when working as a resistance member, but that he only heard about the bodies at 21 Rue le Sueur after being released from Nazi custody, and he assumed they were dumped by his disbanded Flytox network. Prosecutors completely rejected his story, having found no evidence of his claims, and they charged him with 27 counts of murder, as well as for stealing 200 million francs in cash, gold and jewels. Petiot's trial began on the 18th of March 1946 at the Palais de Justice in front of 3 judges and a 7-man jury. Present in the courtroom were 49 suitcases retrieved from Petiot's property, stacked up next to the jury to show the gravity of his crimes. These were the supposed suitcases of his victims. Prosecutors were assisted by 12 civil lawyers, who Petiot gladly bantered with from the stand. In fact, Petiot played a large role in his own defense, frequently grilling witnesses and making jokes with the prosecutors. When asked why inspectors couldn't find the victim he himself alleged to be alive and well in South America, Petiot smiled and said, "South America is a big place." Petiot refused to describe his weapons and had answers as to why each of his victims were not actually victims. As is typical of psychopaths, Petiot's lies were so pathological that it was difficult to catch him in one, as he could just skirt around it and create a new story. At one point, the judge was frustrated with Petiot for doodling in court, to which he replied, "I am listening, but it doesn't really interest me very much." After the second day of the trial, 2 jurors were heard referring to Petiot as a demon, an appalling murderer, and while Petiot's lawyers demanded a mistrial, the 2 jurors in question were simply replaced. The story of a well-respected doctor turned serial killer blew up in the press, and everyone followed the case closely. People were in disbelief how this man had managed to escape capture for so long, and how he had so brutally killed innocent people who were coming to him for a better life and to escape France. The public were angry and disgusted in him, and he quickly became known as Dr. Satan. On the 5th day of the trial, all judges and jurors visited the property at 21 Rue le Sueur, and as neighbours and police shouted at Petiot, he joked, "Peculiar homecoming, don't you think?" Marcel Petiot maintained his innocence throughout, saying that he had indeed killed 19 of the 27 victims identified at the house, but that they were all Germans and collaborators, and that it was really no problem. He also said that they were among the 63 enemies of France that he had killed between 1940 and 1945, but didn't identify the other 44, stating that, "I don't have to justify myself for murders I'm not accused of committing." Petiot's lawyer's closing statement framed Petiot as a hero of the resistance, but the judges and jury were luckily not convinced. A 3-hour deliberation took place, and of the 135 criminal charges, the court found him guilty on all but 9 counts, and Marcel Petiot was sentenced to death. As Petiot waited his execution, he smiled as he asked, "When are they going to assassinate me?" Petiot also refused the option to see a priest prior to his execution, as he said he wanted to take his baggage with him. After briefly being postponed to a guillotine malfunction, a portable guillotine was delivered to the prison at 3:30 a.m. on the 25th of May, 1946, ready for action an hour later. Dr Marcel Petiot refused a glass of rum but accepted a cigarette. He also decided to meet with the prison chaplain for his wife's sake, saying, "I am not a religious man and my conscience is clean." One of the witnesses to the occasion, Dr Albert Paul, commented that Petiot moved with ease, as though he were walking into his office for a routine appointment. Petiot signed the register, his hands were tied and his neck was shaved. Before being strapped to the table, Petiot turned to the audience and said, "Gentlemen, I ask you not to look. This will not be very pretty." The guillotine blade dropped at 5:05 a.m, and according to everyone who was there, Petiot had a big smile plastered on his face as his head hit the floor.